All right, folks, get ready for a real brain teaser today.
Yeah, we're diving deep into some seriously heavy philosophy.
You guys sent in some really thought-provoking stuff. We've got Benatar,
Or Qatar.
Rorty Herd,
Infodentar.
even the Tibetan Book of the Dead.
This time, we're tackling a question that's, well, kinda a downer.
It's a big one, that's for sure.
It is being born. Kind of a raw deal.
Wow,
I
wow,
know.
right? It's a question humanity has grappled with for centuries, really.
Yeah, and these sources,
They offer some seriously different perspectives.
to put it mildly.
Let's kick things off with philosopher David Benatar.
Okay.
He's the author of Better Never to Have Been, and let me tell you,
Catchy title.
it's a wild ride.
So what's the gist?
Benatar throws down a philosophical gauntlet.
Okay.
He claims that being born
Just existing.
is always a harm,
Always. No matter what.
no matter what.
Even if you win the lottery and your biggest problem is deciding which tropical island to buy.
Even then,
Wow.
he argues that even what we consider a good life,
The best life is inevitably full of disappointments
Yeah.
and suffering.
okay, I mean, he's not wrong.
He's not wrong.
I think about all those parents posting on social media about the joys of parenthood,
Right?
and I'm like, are we looking at the same situation here?
It's like they're glossing over, like, a whole lot of sleepless nights and temper tantrum.
Exactly. And Benatar really makes you question
He really does.
how often we sugarcoat the struggles of life, especially when we talk about having kids.
That's exactly the kind of reflection Benatar sparks.
He's like that friend who's brutally honest.
the one who tells you your new haircut isn't all that flattering.
Yeah, exactly. He doesn't beat around the bush.
He gets straight to the point.
So how does he justify this whole being born is always bad thing?
Well, he points to what he calls the asymmetry between pleasure and pain.
Asymmetry.
Yeah, think of it like this.
Okay.
Imagine a world with absolutely no living beings.
No people, no animals, no plants, nothing.
Nothing at all.
Just like a big empty void.
Exactly. Now, in this void, there's no pain because there's no to experience it, right?
Makes sense.
And Benatar would say that absence of pain, even with no one around to enjoy it, is inherently good.
It's like the default setting is good.
Exactly. But now, think about pleasure.
Okay.
In this empty world, there's no pleasure either.
Right. Because there's no one to feel
But
it.
here's the thing. Is that absence of pleasure actually bad?
I guess not, because there's no one around to miss it.
Exactly. And that's the asymmetry.
So it's like if a tree falls in the forest and no one's around, it doesn't care if it makes a sound or not.
Exactly. And Benatar argues that this asymmetry should make us rethink this whole procreation thing.
Like having kids.
Yeah, he's saying that even with the best intentions.
You want your kids to be happy and all that
Of course.
by bringing a child into the world.
You're knowingly imposing a risk of suffering.
Suffering they didn't ask for.
Exactly. They didn't consent to this whole being alive thing.
Okay, that's a pretty heavy thought.
FFE stuff.
It makes those, what were we thinking, having kids,
Yeah.
memes seem kind of profound.
Right. Like maybe those parents are onto something.
But to be clear, Benatar isn't saying that life isn't worth living for those of us who are already here, right?
Right. He focuses on the act of creating life.
Not the value of the lives that already exist.
Exactly. He's not advocating for mistreating people or,
Right, this isn't about promoting self-harm or anything like that.
No, not at all.
It's more about the ethics of imposing existence in the first place.
Exactly. It's a really challenging perspective.
It challenges some really deeply held beliefs, that's for sure.
Like the idea that having a family is a good thing or that more life is always better.
He even connects it to, like, the ethics of abortion.
He does.
He suggests that earlier in pregnancy, it might be the more morally sound choice.
That's definitely one of the most controversial aspects of his view.
I can imagine. It sparked a lot of debate,
It has.
especially among, like, ethicists and disability rights advocates.
Yeah.
It's a really complex issue.
It is. And Benatar's argument, which is often called the antinatalist view.
Antinatalists so against birth.
Exactly. It raises a really fundamental question.
Which is?
If we could choose, knowing all the potential for suffering that life brings,
Knowing about heartbreak and loss and disappointment,
all of it,
would we still opt into existence?
that's the question Benatar wants us to grapple with.
Wow, okay.
It's a tough one.
No kidding. Let's say, just for the sake of argument,
Okay.
we entertain Benatar's view.
We go down this rabbit hole.
Where does it lead us? What are the implications of all this?
Well, it leads to a pretty radical conclusion.
Which is, don't leave me hanging.
Benatar believes that phased human extinction.
Whoa, extinction. Like the end of humanity.
Not in a fiery apocalypse kind of way.
Okay.
More like a gradual fading away.
A slow fade to black.
Exactly. He sees it as the most ethical path.
The most ethical.
Yeah, because it leads to the least amount of harm.
So it's less end of the world and more like...
It's the most compassionate
I mean, I get it, based on his logic.
It's all about minimizing suffering.
Even if it means fewer individuals exist.
Exactly. That's what makes his view so radical.
It goes against the grain of how we usually think about population.
It really does.
Like usually more people are seen as a good thing.
More hands to help, more minds to create, that kind of thing.
Exactly. But Benatar subscribes to what's called the total view of population ethics.
Where the goal is to reduce the total amount of suffering.
Regardless of how many individuals are involved.
Precisely.
So it's less about the more the merrier and more about, are we sure we're being responsible with the more part?
Exactly. It makes you really think differently about things, doesn't it?
It really does. It's like we're all about progress and growth and all that.
Right.
But Benatar's like, hold on a minute. Are we even sure that's a good thing?
He's making us question some pretty fundamental assumptions.
It's a real mind bender.
It is.
But okay, so we've got this one view, right? This total view.
Where the goal is to minimize suffering overall.
But there are other ways of looking at population ethics, right?
There are indeed.
Like, how do other philosophers approach this whole population question?
Well, a more common one is the impersonal average view.
Impersonal average. What's that all about?
It's about prioritizing a higher average well-being for the group.
So, like, if most people are doing okay,
even if some individuals are struggling,
then overall it's a net positive.
Exactly. It's about maintaining a certain standard for the majority.
Even if it means some folks get left behind.
That's the basic idea.
Okay, and how does Benatar's view clash with that?
Well, Benatar would argue that even if the average person is relatively happy,
Which, let's be honest, is debatable.
true, but even if we accept that premise,
Okay.
the suffering of those who are struggling still matters.
It's not just canceled out by the happiness of others.
Exactly. Benatar would say we can't just ignore those individuals.
So it's not just about the numbers game, the averages.
It's about recognizing the moral weight of each individual's experience.
Even if it brings down the overall happiness score.
That's Benatar's stance, yeah.
Okay, that's a pretty different way of looking at things.
It is.
And it makes you think about all those policy decisions that are based on this whole greatest good for the greatest number idea.
Right, like healthcare or education or even environmental policies.
Exactly. It makes you wonder if we're really considering the full impact on everyone.
Especially those who are already marginalized or disadvantaged.
Right, they're often the ones who bear the brunt of those decisions.
Benatar's view really throws a wrench into those traditional ethical frameworks.
It does. It's like he's saying, hold on, we're not just calculating happiness points here. These are real lives with real experiences.
Exactly. And those experiences, both positive and negative, have to be taken seriously.
Okay, so we've got the total view and the impersonal average view. Are there any other major players in this population ethics game?
There's also the person-affecting view.
Person-affecting. That sounds even more complicated.
It's not as complex as it sounds.
Okay, hit me with it.
The person-affecting view focuses on the rights and well-being of specific individuals.
Both the people who are alive now.
And the people who could potentially exist in the future.
So it's like taking into account future generations as well.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that our actions today have consequences for the people who come after us.
Which is a pretty big responsibility when you think about it.
It is indeed.
And how does Benatar's argument sit with this person-affecting view?
Well, remember, Benatar believes that coming into existence is always a harm.
Right, even if it's a life full of love and laughter and all those good things.
Exactly. So from his perspective, we're not doing future generations any favors by bringing them into existence.
It's like we think we're giving them the gift of life, but he's saying it's more like we're burdening them with the potential for suffering.
That's a pretty harsh way of putting it, but yeah, that's the gist of it.
Okay, so Benatar's view is kind of at odds with all these major approaches to population ethics.
It's safe to say he's an outlier in the field.
He's not afraid of a little controversy.
Not at all. But that's what makes his work so thought-provoking.
It forces us to confront some really uncomfortable questions.
It does, and whether we agree with his conclusions or not.
It's a conversation worth having.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've gone down the rabbit hole of Benatar's antinatalist view.
And explored the implications for population ethics.
But you also included Richard Rorty in the mix for this deep dive.
I did.
And his ideas seem like the philosophical counterpoint to Benatar, wouldn't you say?
They're definitely coming from very different places.
Right, where Benatar sees inherent harm in existence.
Rorty sees boundless possibility.
It's like they're looking at the same world through completely different lenses.
Exactly. And those different lenses lead to radically different conclusions about how we should live our lives.
So let's talk about Rorty's lens.
Okay, so Rorty was all about this idea of contingency.
Contingency. I'm not sure I'm familiar with that term.
It's basically the idea that our lives are shaped by chance.
Not by some predetermined destiny.
Exactly. There's no grand plan, no cosmic script.
So it's less everything happens for a reason.
And more, let's make something meaningful out of whatever happens.
I like that. It's a much more empowering way of looking at things.
Rorty would agree.
But how do we actually do that? How do we create meaning in a world that often feels random and chaotic?
Well, that's where Rorty's concept of irony comes in.
Irony. Like the opposite of what you expect to happen.
Not exactly.
Okay, because that seems kind of fitting, given the whole life is random thing.
It's more about recognizing the limitations of our own perspective.
Okay, I think I'm getting lost here.
Think of it like this.
Okay.
Imagine you were raised in a very strict family.
With lots of rules and traditions.
Exactly. And those rules and traditions were based on a specific set of beliefs.
Like religious beliefs.
It could be religious or political or even just cultural.
Okay, I'm with you.
Now imagine that as you grow older,
You start to question those beliefs.
you realize that maybe they don't hold all the answers.
Maybe you even decide to abandon those beliefs altogether.
But here's the thing. Even though you no longer subscribe to the same beliefs,
You can still appreciate the value of your upbringing,
the traditions, the sense of community.
even if the core beliefs no longer resonate with you.
Exactly. And that's Rorty's idea of the ironist.
Someone who can hold these seemingly contradictory ideas at the same time.
Precisely. They recognize that there's no one right way of seeing the world.
And that our understanding is always evolving.
Exactly. So for Rorty, creating meaning in a contingent world
A world where anything goes.
involves embracing that uncertainty
Being open to new
and
perspectives.
finding ways to connect with others.
Even if we don't agree on everything.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's less about finding the right answers.
And more about engaging in the ongoing conversation.
About being open to the possibility that we might be wrong.
And that's okay.
Wow, that's a pretty radical idea in itself.
It is, especially in a world that often seems obsessed with certainty and absolutes.
Where everyone's got an opinion and they're all convinced they're right.
Exactly. Rorty challenges us to step outside of those rigid ways of thinking
To embrace the ambiguity and uncertainty of existence.
and to find meaning in the connections we forge with others.
Even if those connections are messy and imperfect.
Exactly. Because ultimately, that's all we've got.
It's a very different way of looking at things.
It is.
But I kind of like it.
I thought you might.
So we've got Benatar's rather bleak view of existence as inherently a harm.
And Rorty urging us to embrace the chaos and create our own meaning.
It's like two sides of a philosophical coin.
Two sides of the same human experience, perhaps.
Right. And then we've got Osamu Dazai's No Longer Human, bringing in yet another layer.
Dazai offers a raw and often unsettling look at the human experience.
It's definitely not a lighthearted beach read.
Not at all. It's meant to make you feel something.
And it does, that's for sure.
Dazai's protagonist, Obayoso,
He's a bit of a mess, isn't he?
he's struggling, that's for sure.
With
a profound sense of alienation.
like he doesn't belong anywhere.
Exactly. He just can't seem to connect with the world around him.
And it's not like he's trying to push people away.
No, he desperately wants to be accepted.
To find a place where he fits in.
But he just can't seem to bridge the gap.
Between himself and everyone else.
Exactly. And that struggle.
It's heartbreaking to read about.
It is, and it makes you wonder.
What?
Is the search for meaning even possible?
In a world that often feels indifferent to our existence.
That's the question Dazai seems to be grappling with.
It's a question that feels especially relevant today.
With so many people feeling increasingly isolated?
Despite being hyper-connected digitally,
Exactly. We're more connected than ever before.
but also more alone.
It's a strange paradox.
It is, and Dazai captures that feeling so well.
He does, and in a way that transcends cultural boundaries.
Right, even though the story is set in Japan.
The themes of isolation, societal pressure.
The search for meaning in a world that often feels meaningless.
Those are universal experiences.
They are, and they tie back to those big questions we were discussing earlier.
About the nature of existence.
And the purpose of life.
Dazai doesn't offer any easy answers.
He doesn't.
But he forces us to confront the darkness.
The parts of the human experience that we often try to avoid.
And in doing so, he reminds us that those parts of ourselves...
they're just as real as the parts that crave joy and connection.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got Benatar's philosophical argument against existence.
Rorty's call to embrace the unknown and create our own meaning.
And Dazai's raw and unflinching look at the human condition.
It's quite the philosophical trifecta.
It is. And to top it all off, we've got the Tibetan Book of the Dead on our plate.
That's right, we do.
Which is a whole other kettle of fish.
It's definitely a unique perspective on death and consciousness.
To say the least. I mean, Benatar's over here arguing against existence altogether.
Right.
And then we have the Pardo Thodol.
Which is its Tibetan name.
Right. Thanks for clarifying.
Laying out a whole roadmap for what happens after death. It's like they're working from completely different assumptions.
They are.
So for those of us who aren't familiar with Tibetan Buddhism...
what's the Bardo Thodol all about?
In a nutshell.
It's essentially a guidebook.
A guidebook for what?
For navigating the intermediate state after death.
The intermediate state?
Yeah, it's not exactly heaven or hell.
Okay, that's helpful.
It's more like a transitional period.
Between lives.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Tibetan Buddhism teaches that we go through a series of these Bardo states.
Bardo states.
Yeah, it's like a journey.
A journey where?
Through different realms of existence.
Okay, now we're getting into some seriously trippy territory.
It can be a lot to wrap your head around.
No kidding. So what happens in these Bardo states?
Well, according to the Bardo Thodol,
okay,
the deceased encounters all sorts of things.
Like what?
Peaceful deities, wrathful deities.
Deities, like gods and goddesses.
Yeah, but they're not like the gods and goddesses of Greek mythology.
Okay, that's good to know. They're more like representations of different energies or aspects of ourselves.
Okay, that's a little less scary.
And the deceased's experiences in these Bardo states.
They're not random, are they?
No, they're shaped by the deceased's karma.
Their karma.
Yeah, like the actions and intentions they accumulated during their life.
So it's like, if you were a good person...
you're more likely to encounter peaceful deities.
And if you weren't so good?
Well... let's just say things might get a little more intense.
Okay, I think I'm starting to understand.
It's a complex system of beliefs.
It is, but the basic idea is that our actions have consequences.
Even after we die.
And that those consequences shape our experiences in the afterlife.
Exactly.
Wow, okay.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. But it's fascinating, right?
Definitely. It shows us how differently different cultures have thought about these big questions of life and death.
And it's a good reminder that our own beliefs aren't the only ones out there.
Not by a long shot.
It's a lot to process, that's for sure.
It really is.
I mean, we've got Benatar saying, don't even bother, existence is a trap.
Right, very optimistic.
And then there's Rorty cheering us on like, hey, make your own meaning, it's all up for grabs.
Two very different approaches to life.
And then Dazai's like, here's a hefty dose of existential dread. Just for fun.
He doesn't sugarcoat things.
Not even a little bit.
And just when you think you've wrapped your head around it all...
we bring in Wittgenstein talking about language games.
Right, reminding us that our very tools of thought might be tripping us up.
Like maybe we're not even having the right conversation.
Because we're not speaking the same language, philosophically speaking.
And then, just for kicks, we throw in the Tibetan Book of the Dead.
Which offers a whole other framework for understanding death and consciousness.
And possibly even reality itself.
It's a pretty wild ride.
It is. So, after all that, I have to ask.
Shoot.
Where do we even begin to find meaning in all of this?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is.
And I don't think there's a single answer, a magic formula.
Okay, that's kind of what I figured.
But I think that's okay.
It is. How so?
Because the search itself is where the meaning lies.
So it's not about finding the right answer.
Not necessarily.
It's more about engaging in the process of questioning.
of exploring different perspectives.
Of grappling with these big ideas?
Exactly. It's like hiking up a mountain.
Okay, I like where you're going with this.
You don't see the full panorama from the base, right?
Right.
You have to keep climbing, keep exploring.
To get a better view.
And even then, your view is shaped by your own unique perspective.
Your own experiences, your own biases.
Exactly. So it's less about finding the right answer to this meaning of life thing.
And more about exploring the different paths we can take while we're here.
Precisely. And just as no two hikers will have the exact same experience.
No two people will find meaning in the exact same way.
Exactly. Your personal meaning will be unique to you.
That's actually kind of comforting.
It is, in a way.
Because it takes the pressure off.
Right. It's not about living up to some external standard.
It's about figuring out what resonates with you as an individual.
Exactly. And that process of discovery.
It's ongoing, right? It's not like you just figure it out one day and that's it.
Absolutely. It's a lifelong journey of learning and growing.
And maybe even changing your mind along the way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's what makes it so interesting.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We really have.
From the ethics of being born,
to the nature of consciousness,
the power of language,
a search for meaning,
and even what might happen after we die.
It's been a wild ride.
It has. And through it all, I think what stuck with me the most
What's that?
is that there's no one right answer to these big questions.
I think that's a really important takeaway.
It is, because it's so easy to get caught up in the idea.
That there's only one way to see the world.
One right way to live your life.
But that's just not true.
There are as many ways to find meaning as there are people on this planet.
And that's a beautiful thing, don't you think?
It is.
So if there's one thing I hope our listeners take away from this conversation,
What would it be?
don't be afraid to ask the big questions.
Even if they make you uncomfortable.
Even if you don't think there are any easy answers.
Because the process of searching is where you'll find your own unique truth.
Exactly.
That's a great note to end on.
I think so too.
Well, folks, there you have it.
Another deep dive in the books.
Be sure to check back with us soon for another thought-provoking exploration of, well,
Existence, the universe, and everything.
until next time.